I stood in my own foyer, watching my daughter-in-law's fingers hover an inch above the door handle forged from the silver she once tried to control. The engraved initials, mine and my late husband's, caught the light, and her eyes narrowed like it was an insult etched in steel. She didn't recognize the shape yet, not fully, but she would. She told her mother-in-law not to touch the good silver. Now the daughter-in-law couldn't even touch the front door. And for the first time in 4 decades, the mother-in-law didn't flinch when someone else called it family. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The message arrived while Ruth was halfway through folding dish towels. Don't touch the good silver. It's for special occasions. 7 words, plain as paper. And yet Ruth stood there, hand frozen mid-fold, a warm cotton square dangling between her fingers like a flag of surrender she never agreed to wave. The text came from Sam. Of course it did, and sat smugly on Ruth's phone screen as if it had every right to dictate her life. Ruth's first instinct wasn't anger, it was disbelief. She looked up, slowly, at the hutch across the room. The glass-paneled cabinet had sat in that same corner for nearly 40 years, oak polished smooth by time and care. Behind its doors, nestled in velvet-lined drawers, was the Ellis silver set, a wedding gift from Harold's mother, passed down when they bought the house. Every piece gleamed like rain-kissed pewter, lovingly maintained over decades of birthdays, Thanksgivings, and the occasional Thursday, when Harold decided a grilled cheese deserved elegance. She set the towel aside and crossed the room. The hutch doors opened with a soft creak. Her fingers hovered over the top drawer. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she turned and called out, "Mark?" A muffled reply came from the living room. "Yeah, Mom." He stepped in moments later, still holding the remote like a shield. Ruth lifted her phone without a word and showed him the screen. He read the message, blinked, then rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when caught between 2 forces. "I think Sam just meant she wants to keep it nice, preserve it for when people come over." Ruth arched one eyebrow, a small, deliberate motion with the weight of a lecture behind it. "People come over every Sunday. You mean to tell me family doesn't count as an occasion anymore?" Mark hesitated. "I think she's just being careful." "Careful," Ruth repeated, the word sour on her tongue. "It's mine, Mark. That silver was never Sam's to gatekeep." He raised both hands. "Not arguing, just maybe let it slide? For peace's sake?" Ruth let out a short breath. "Peace is a coat you put on when company comes. This house is not a museum." Before Mark could respond, the screen door creaked and closed again. "Smells like disappointment in here," Clara said, setting a bakery box on the counter. She peeled off her sunglasses with the flair of a woman who never apologized for arriving unannounced. Mark gave her a nod and slipped out quickly. Ruth took one of the scones Clara brought, lemon poppy seed, and poured 2 coffees. The kitchen filled with the quiet clinks and clatter of mugs and sugar spoons. "So," Clara said, watching her carefully, "what did Samantha do now?" Ruth didn't speak right away. She retrieved the phone from the counter and handed it over. Clara read the message in one sweep, then set the phone down as though it had insulted her personally. "Oh, no, that's not a suggestion. That's a command." Ruth nodded. "Apparently I need clearance now to touch what belongs to me." Clara took a long sip of her coffee, eyes narrowed. "You ever think she's marking territory?" "I think she's confused about who owns the land," Ruth replied. They sat for a moment, the kitchen clock ticking between them. Clara leaned back, folded her arms and smirked. "So? What are you going to do?" Ruth's answer came slowly, but it landed like a stone in water. "Special occasions don't wait for permission. They happen when I decide." She stood, walked to the hutch, and this time opened the drawer. The silver gleamed under the afternoon light like a quiet challenge. Clara raised an eyebrow. "You're not thinking what I think you're thinking." But Ruth didn't respond. She was already lifting one of the serving spoons, not with nostalgia, but with intent. The silver spoon was still warm in her hand when Ruth descended into the crawl space. Dust greeted her like an old acquaintance, swirling as she pulled the chain light above her late husband's filing cabinet. The metal drawers groaned, reluctant to open after years of neglect. But Ruth had time, and more than that, she had motivation. She flipped through layers of crisp manila folders, each one labeled in Harold's neat, engineer-perfect script: Roof Repairs 2001, Gas Company Receipts, Travel, 1989. Then finally, Household Assets, Ellis. Bingo. She carried the file upstairs, coughing once as she re-entered the light. Clara looked up from the kitchen table, where she was cutting the last scone into even halves with surgical precision. "Didn't know we were excavating," she said dryly. Ruth laid the folder on the table, just dusting off some clarity. Inside, a yellowed envelope with a handwritten note in Harold's blocky print. Wedding Silver, 1982. Ruth opened it carefully, revealing an old photograph and a brittle receipt folded in quarters. The photo showed her and Harold, impossibly young, standing behind their wedding cake. The silver set was spread on the table in front of them, catching the flash of the camera. Ruth touched the corner of the image, tracing the edge of her younger self's smile. "That's the exact set?" Clara asked, leaning closer. "Every piece." Ruth unfolded the receipt. "Purchased outright, paid in full by Harold's mother, gifted to us, that same week." Clara raised her brows. "So legally—" Ruth was already pulling out her phone. "I want this in writing, from someone who can speak more loudly than Samantha." She scrolled to Linda Fraser in her contacts and hit call. Linda picked up on the second ring. "Ruth, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need to confirm ownership," Ruth said, brisk but calm. "Family silver, gifted over 40 years ago. I have the receipt and a photo from our wedding day. Is that enough?" Linda didn't miss a beat. "Assuming the gift was made directly to you and Harold as a couple, and there's no written dispute of transfer afterward, then yes, it's yours outright. Even if someone married to my son believes otherwise?" "Their belief is irrelevant. Possession is backed by documentation, not opinion." Ruth smiled. "Thank you, Linda." Clara gave her a look once the call ended, something between admiration and concern. "So what now? You going to frame the receipt and tape it to her Range Rover?" "I thought about it." Ruth slid the items back into the folder. Clara swirled the last of her coffee. "You thinking of selling it then? Show her it's not about sentimentality?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She stood and returned to the hutch, gently opening the drawer again. The silver caught the afternoon sun like it knew it had something to prove. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, turning a fork in her fingers, "that things of value deserve to live, not hide." Clara tilted her head. "That's a yes or a no?" Ruth turned, the beginnings of a sly smile curling at her mouth. "It's a better." She closed the drawer with careful finality and carried the file into her study. From the hallway, Clara called, "You know, most people just post passive-aggressive Facebook quotes when they're pissed." "I'm not most people," Ruth called back. She placed the photo of her and Harold next to the old Tiffany receipt on the desk, side by side like sentinels. Her fingers hovered briefly, then opened her laptop. Ruth hadn't been down this stretch of Charleston in years. The sidewalks were cracked, the street lined with brick buildings that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Reagan administration. Warehouses sat like tired sentries behind rusted chain-link fences, a stark contrast to the manicured neighborhoods just a few miles east. She double-checked the address scrawled on a notepad in her passenger seat. Turner Iron Works. Tucked behind a feed supply store and a boat mechanic's shop, it wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. She parked under the shade of an overgrown crepe myrtle, took one last look at the silver-laden tote beside her, and stepped out into the heat. The building's brick facade had once been red, but time and salt air had worn it into mottled shades of brown and rust. The sign above the door, Turner Iron Works, was metal, of course, hand-welded and elegant in its own understated way. The shop door creaked as she pushed it open. The air inside was warm and metallic, tinged with the scent of oil and scorched steel. A rhythmic clanging echoed from somewhere in the back, followed by the unmistakable hiss of a welding torch. Sparks flew in bursts behind a tall sheet of iron, lighting up the dusty space like fireflies. For a moment, Ruth simply stood there, the shop's atmosphere sinking into her skin, alive, rough-edged, and deeply certain of its purpose. Then the torch hissed off. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Jack Turner appeared from behind a heavy curtain of chain links, his protective visor still pushed up over his forehead. He was taller than she expected, broad in the shoulders, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. His hair was streaked with gray in a way that looked more like metal than age, and his beard was neatly kept. Practical, not vain. "You must be Ruth," he said, wiping his hands on a thick shop rag. His voice had a gravelly kindness to it, the kind that came from years of smoke, salt air, and not wasting words. "I am," she replied, gripping the leather handles of her tote more tightly. "You're Jack?" "Last time I checked," he said with a slight grin. "You said on the phone you had something unusual." She stepped forward and set the tote down on a wide metal table. As she unzipped it, the old velvet pouches rustled softly, revealing rows of gleaming sterling silver. The set caught the ambient light in a way that made it look almost lit from within. Jack leaned over, studying the pieces with a reverence she didn't expect from a man who spent his days melting metal. "Real silver," he said quietly. "Old, too. They don't make it like this anymore." "No, they don't," Ruth said, "and I don't intend to let it sit in a drawer another day." Jack looked up. "You want to sell it?" She shook her head. "I want it transformed into something no one can ignore." Her hand slipped into her purse and produced a piece of paper, folded in thirds. When she opened it, a pencil sketch stretched across the page. A front door handle, elongated and graceful, with delicate spoon bowls layered like petals and fork tines woven into a center ridge. Jack studied the drawing, then let out a low whistle. "Now that's different." "I don't need delicate," Ruth said. "I need deliberate." He nodded slowly, already pulling a mechanical pencil from behind his ear. "What if we used the ladles here for curvature and depth," he said, pointing to one edge of the design, "and then fit the tines along the spine, like filigree, but solid, something with weight. You want it to say something when people grab it." "I want it to say everything," Ruth answered. Jack smiled, not kindly but knowingly. "You came to the right place. I can do it. 4 weeks, give or take. Depends on how the casting and cooling go." "Take what you need," Ruth said. "The whole set's yours." "Most people melt heirlooms into lockets or cufflinks," he said, gathering the silver carefully. "You're putting it on the front of your house." "That's where statements belong," she replied. He looked at her for a moment, not quite studying, not quite questioning, just seeing. "All right," he said. "I'll get started this week. I'll send you sketches as I go." As she turned to leave, the shop door heavy in her hand, her phone buzzed inside her pocket. She pulled it out without urgency. It was a message from Sam. "Holiday dinner is at our place this year. Bring the good silver." Ruth stared at the message for a long, measured beat. Then she locked the screen, slipped the phone back into her purse, and walked out without a word. The roast chicken came out of the oven golden, its skin blistered and crisp, with rosemary curling along the surface like veins. Ruth basted it one last time before placing it on her grandmother's oval serving platter, chipped at one edge but otherwise faithful. She arranged the carrots and potatoes around it with practiced care, not for show, but for rhythm. Clara was already in the dining room, folding linen napkins with the kind of concentration only mischief could sharpen. "Do you want me to light the candles?" she called. "No," Ruth said, smoothing her apron. "We're not performing tonight." Clara raised a brow but said nothing, her lips twitching as she adjusted one of the chairs. Outside, car doors slammed. Footsteps echoed on the porch. The front door creaked open without a knock, and Ruth heard Sam's voice float in ahead of her. "And if she says she didn't get the text, I swear to God—" Ruth stepped into view and Sam cut herself off with a tight-lipped smile. "Hi, Ruth. Smells rustic. Behind her, Mark offered an apologetic shrug as he helped their daughter out of her coat. The little girl ran straight to Clara, who greeted her like an old friend and let her sit beside her at the table. Dinner was served 15 minutes later. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just the clatter of plates and the slow realization that something specific, was missing. Sam picked up the butter knife beside her salad plate and turned it over once, then again. Her gaze flicked around the table, eyes narrowing on the mismatched everyday cutlery. "This isn't the usual," she said, lifting a spoon as if it had personally offended her. "No," Ruth replied, ladling gravy onto her potatoes. "The silver's being cleaned." There was a silence then, brief but razor-sharp. Clara shifted in her seat and reached for her water glass to hide the grin creeping across her face. "Being cleaned," Sam repeated, her voice slightly higher, as if trying the phrase on for size. "Professionally?" "Of course," Ruth said, not looking up. "It's a delicate process. Takes time." Sam's fork clinked against her plate a little too hard. "You could have told me. I would have brought a set from home." "No need," Ruth replied, still composed. "We all manage just fine with these." Mark cleared his throat, then pretended to focus on cutting his chicken. He didn't look at either of them. His silence was strategic. Ruth glanced around the table. The plates were plain white ceramic, the kind she'd bought in bulk from a department store clearance rack 5 years ago. No polish, no shine. But the food on them was hot, seasoned perfectly, and made without a single ounce of performance. "How's the handle project coming?" Clara asked, slicing her roast with a deliberate calm. Ruth smiled. "Beautifully. Jack's very talented." Sam's head snapped up. "Handle project?" Clara took a sip of wine. "Oh, it's going to be stunning. Something you'll notice before you even knock." Sam didn't respond. Her fork hung in the air for a moment before lowering to the plate again. The rest of dinner passed with a fragile, artificial civility. Mark made an awkward comment about local construction delays. Ruth's granddaughter chatted to Clara about school projects. Sam kept glancing at Ruth's place setting as though trying to decode a cipher no one had written for her. By dessert, the tension had folded itself into something quieter but more dangerous, the kind of silence that precedes a crack, not a resolution. As the plates were cleared and coffee was served, Sam stood too quickly. "We should head out," she said, already gathering her daughter's things. "It's a school night." Ruth nodded, not rising. "Thank you for coming." Mark kissed her cheek, awkward and light, then followed his wife out the door. Clara waited until the taillights disappeared down the road before speaking. "Well," she said, finishing her coffee, "I don't know what was more satisfying, the roast or the look on her face." Ruth said nothing for a moment. She walked into the kitchen, rinsed the dishes slowly, and set the plain cutlery back into its drawer, one utensil at a time. The next morning dawned warm and pale, with the kind of humidity that hung heavy before the sun had fully committed to rising. Ruth slid the tote bag onto the passenger seat of her Buick like it was carrying more than just old silver, as if it held something unspoken, unreturnable. By the time she pulled into Turner Ironworks, the heat had already begun to ripple off the pavement in visible waves. The smell of metal and forge smoke greeted her like an old friend who didn't need small talk. Jack was waiting inside, shop lights glowing faintly through the haze. A bench had been cleared for her arrival, covered in canvas sheeting and a few empty molds. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, setting his mug of black coffee down with a metallic thud. Ruth stepped forward and unzipped the bag with slow care. The silver gleamed even in the dim light, forks and spoons nested like sleeping birds, too fragile for the world they were about to enter. "I've been ready longer than I realized," she said. Jack didn't ask any more questions. He began laying the pieces out one by one, sorting them not by size or function but by curvature, by weight, by how they might surrender to the flame. As he adjusted the forge temperature, Ruth moved beside him, watching the entire setup with quiet fascination. He took one of the larger serving spoons, her favorite, if she had to admit it, and placed it in a crucible. The hiss of heat overtaking history was almost musical. "It's strange," she murmured, more to herself than him. "Watching it lose its shape, but not its worth." Jack gave her a sideways glance, nodding. "That's the trick with metal. You change the form, not the value." Minutes passed like small, weighty hours. She watched the alloy liquefy, first reluctant, then all at once, transforming into something primal and elemental. Jack poured the first mold carefully, steady as a surgeon. The liquid silver slid into the carved cavity with precision, and Ruth felt her spine straighten with something she hadn't expected: pride. "Want to see the first cast?" he asked, once it had cooled enough to reveal its shape. She followed him to the work table, where he gently lifted the mold open. The handle was still rough, unfinished, but already bore the beginnings of its intended grace. The spoons layered like overlapping petals, the tines forming a spine down the center. But it was the detail on the bottom edge that caught Ruth's breath. A faint, intentional engraving, EE, her and Harold's initials, hidden in the curl of the handle's base. She didn't say anything. She simply nodded once, as if to seal something silently between her and the metal. At that moment, the shop door creaked, and Clara walked in carrying 2 iced coffees in one hand and her phone in the other. "I brought caffeine and curiosity," she announced, stopping when she saw the half-formed handle on the table. "Well now, that's not just beautiful, that's pointed." Ruth smiled. "Take a picture. For the file dot." Clara didn't ask what she meant by the file. She just pulled out her phone, snapped a few detailed shots, and sent them straight to Ruth's inbox. "I know someone who'll want documentation," Ruth added, "just in case Samantha gets clever." "I'll call Linda," Clara said, already pulling up the contact. "You want her to put something in writing?" "Ownership, transformation, value. The works," Ruth replied. Jack stood quietly nearby, wiping silver dust off his hands with a cloth, letting the women talk like generals finalizing a treaty. And then, right as Clara ended the call, Ruth's phone buzzed. Sam Ellis. The name glared across the screen, stark and unwelcome. Ruth answered without hesitation. "Hello?" Sam's voice came fast, clipped. "I need the silver. I'm hosting the formal holiday dinner. We agreed last year that it would be at our house. I want the real stuff on the table, Ruth." There was a long silence. Ruth could feel the warmth of the silver mold radiating beside her, a literal monument to the very thing Sam had tried to control. "Sam," she said, her voice quiet but deliberate, "the silver isn't available anymore." "What do you mean? It's mine now, too." Ruth didn't respond. She simply looked at the still glowing piece of metal on the table in front of her, reshaped, reimagined, and absolutely, irrevocably hers. Ruth ended the call before Sam could protest again. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, then she locked the phone and placed it face down on Jack's steel workbench. The metal beneath her fingers was still warm from the forge, and that warmth lingered in her bones as she stepped away. She didn't need more words. Jack said nothing. He simply nodded once, as though he'd heard everything without needing to be told. Then he reached for the next handful of silver and began arranging it for the next melt. The hiss of the forge filled the space between them like punctuation. Declarative, final. Back home, Ruth washed her hands slowly in the kitchen sink. The windows were open, the sound of cicadas thick in the summer air. Clara sat at the table with her reading glasses perched halfway down her nose, flipping through a glossy gardening magazine but not really reading it. "She called," Ruth said simply, drying her hands with a towel. Clara didn't look up. "I figured. She wants the silver." Now Clara looked up over her glasses and raised an eyebrow. "She's got nerve, I'll give her that." "She thinks I'm hiding it." "Well, she's not wrong," Clara said, snapping the magazine closed. "But hiding implies shame. You're staging a full-blown exhibit." Ruth allowed herself a small smile as she folded the towel neatly and hung it on the oven handle. Her phone vibrated on the counter. This time it wasn't Sam. It was Mark. Mark Ellis. Hey, Mom, can you just keep the peace? She's stressed about hosting. Maybe bring the set for one night? It's not worth a war. Ruth stared at the message. A single line pulsed through her mind, uninvited but insistent. Not worth a war to whom? She didn't reply. Not yet. Clara leaned over to peek. Let me guess. The middleman's waving a white flag. He wants me to keep the peace. Peace is boring, Clara said, getting up to refill her iced tea. Go for style. Ruth laughed, quietly, almost involuntarily, but it felt good in her chest, like exhaling something stale. Later that afternoon, while the sun was retreating behind the moss-draped oaks and the kitchen held the amber stillness of late day, her phone lit up again. It was Jack. This time he'd sent 3 photos. The first showed a close-up of the handle's spine, polished, clean, the tines of 2 forks woven tightly into a raised seam like architectural lattice. The second was a shot from overhead, showing the overall silhouette emerging, elegant, symmetrical, undeniably bold. The third photo was different. It was a close-up of the initials at the base, EE, now fully engraved, darkened slightly to stand out against the glimmering silver. The edges around the curl had been softened, beveled into a gentle ridge that gave the entire handle a finished, intentional weight. Underneath the photos was a simple caption, "She's taking shape. Thought you'd want to see." Ruth felt something stir in her. Not pride, exactly, but confirmation, like looking at an old photograph and seeing yourself clearly for the first time in decades. She saved the images to her gallery, then opened the drawer of her roll-top desk. Inside was a small wooden frame, once holding a family photo long since removed. She printed the photo of the handle, trimmed the edges, and slid it behind the glass. When she set the frame on her desk, it faced outward, not toward her, but toward the room, a declaration. Clara walked in, saw the photo, and tilted her head slightly. "Is that what I think it is?" Ruth didn't look away from it. It's what she didn't expect. For the first time all week, there was no tension in her shoulders, just stillness. She reached for her phone again, not to reply to Mark, not yet, but to forward the photos to Linda with a short note. "Here's the transformation proof. Keep it on file." The morning air hung heavy with humidity, but it carried a stillness that made the breeze feel intentional, as if the day itself knew something was about to shift. Ruth had opened the windows early, letting the scent of the gardenia bush drift through the house. It calmed her more than she expected. Clara sat in the armchair near the front window, sipping her coffee, a crossword open in her lap, though she hadn't written anything in several minutes. Her eyes kept drifting toward the driveway. "He said 9?" she asked. "Mm-hmm." Ruth was at the front door, wiping the surface down with a soft cloth. Not because it was dusty, she'd already cleaned it twice, but because she wanted the wood to be ready, to welcome what was coming. At 9:04, the sound of tires crunching the gravel snapped them both to attention. Jack's van pulled in smoothly, no decals or fanfare, just practical and quiet, the kind of arrival Ruth had come to admire. Jack stepped out wearing the same heavy canvas apron she'd first seen him in, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back today in a low knot at the nape of his neck. In his hands, wrapped in layers of linen and foam, was the handle. Ruth didn't need to see it yet. She knew it was finished. "Good morning, ladies," Jack said, tipping his head toward Clara. Clara gave him a small nod. "I don't suppose you're here for tea?" "Only if you serve it in thermoses and weld it to the porch," he said with a grin, then turned to Ruth. "Ready?" She nodded. Inside the bundle, the handle lay gleaming, all of it, every spoon, every fork, every scrap of tarnished history she'd handed over was now reborn into a single solid declaration. Its curves were subtle, not flashy, but the craftsmanship demanded attention. You didn't look at it, you noticed it. The initials EE were etched at the base like a whisper to those who knew to look closely. Jack knelt by the front door and set his tools down with precision. Ruth stood back and watched him work, each bolt carefully aligned, every screw tightened by hand. She hadn't realized how intimate it would feel, watching this man she barely knew install something so personal into the bones of her home. When it was finally secured, he stepped aside. "Give her a test." Ruth stepped forward slowly, not rushing the moment. Her fingers found the cool surface of the metal, its texture both familiar and foreign. She ran her hand along its length, letting her palm absorb its temperature, its weight. The handle was solid, firm in her grasp, a quiet force embedded in her threshold. Not decoration, not legacy on a pedestal. Usable, present, real. Behind her, Clara raised her phone and snapped a photo. "You're beaming," she said softly. "I feel it," Ruth answered, not letting go of the handle just yet. Jack stood with his arms crossed, expression unreadable but eyes kind. "It's yours now," he said, "every inch of it." Ruth turned to him and reached for the envelope she'd tucked into her cardigan pocket earlier. Inside was a check and a handwritten note. She held it out. "For your time. And your hands." He took it without ceremony. "You were one of my favorites. People don't usually know what they're asking for. You did." Ruth offered a small smile. "Sometimes it just takes longer to figure out how to ask." Jack gave a slight nod, picked up his tools, and left with a quiet, respectful goodbye. His van pulled away just as slowly as it had arrived. The house was quiet again. Clara joined her on the porch, looking at the handle like it had grown there on its own. "I almost don't want to touch it," she said. "Feels sacred." "You should," Ruth replied. "It's meant to be used." Clara reached out, fingers grazing the edge. "Well then," she murmured. "It's the first time Silver's ever said welcome instead of watch yourself." They both laughed. The late morning sun was casting long, warm shadows across Ruth's porch when the doorbell didn't ring. Instead, Ruth heard the gravel shift under cautious footsteps, then the hollow sound of someone stepping onto the wide front stoop. From the kitchen, where she was arranging lemon bars on a ceramic platter, she could see through the narrow front window, Sam standing just inches from the door. But Sam wasn't knocking. She was staring. Specifically, she was staring at the handle. Her hand hovered an inch above it, fingers outstretched but unmoving, like she wasn't sure whether to touch it or recoil. Her head tilted slightly, brows pulling together in a small knot of confusion, and then recognition. She reached out and slowly ran 2 fingers across the polished spine, tracing the raised ridges with a slowness that made Ruth's pulse tick up a notch. The door swung open before she could grip it. "Sam?" Ruth said evenly. Sam's hand dropped like she'd been caught stealing. "Oh," she said, recovering quickly. "I was just—" She motioned vaguely to the handle. "That's new." "Just finished yesterday," Ruth replied, holding the door wide. "Coffee's already on." Sam stepped inside without further comment, but not before giving the handle one last lingering look over her shoulder. Clara was already seated at the dining table, sipping her drink and idly scrolling through her phone. She looked up when Sam entered, her smile tight, controlled, polite enough to pass. "Good morning, Samantha," Clara said. "Nice day for surprises." Sam blinked, either ignoring the tone or pretending to. "Mark said he'd meet me here. Is he running late?" "He's in the back," Ruth said. "Something about replacing the birdhouse. He'll be in shortly." They sat. Ruth poured the coffee, dark roast her preferred, and passed the lemon bars across the table. Sam took one but didn't eat it. Her eyes kept drifting involuntarily toward the door, toward the handle. "So," she said finally, after several sips, "what exactly is that?" "On the door?" Clara looked up sharply from her cup, interest piqued. Ruth didn't rush her answer. "A custom piece," she said. "I commissioned it." Sam's smile was brittle. "From that metalworker, the one Clara mentioned?" "Yes," Ruth replied. "Jack Turner. He does architectural work. Quite skilled." "Huh," Sam said, staring into her coffee as if it might provide more satisfying answers. "It looked familiar. The way it curves." "I imagine it does," Ruth said calmly, not looking away. Sam's fingers tightened slightly around her mug. Mark walked in at that moment, shaking sawdust from his sleeves and wiping his hands with a rag. "Hey, sorry I'm late," he said, leaning down to kiss his wife's cheek. That old feeder finally fell apart. He reached for a lemon bar and took a bite before sitting down, utterly oblivious to the current beneath the table. "This coffee's good, Mom," he said, chewing. "Handle looks great too, by the way. You finally got it installed?" "I did," Ruth said. Jack was efficient, thoughtful, exact. Sam flinched just slightly at the last word, then smiled without humor. "Well, I suppose everyone's putting their energy somewhere these days." Clara's mouth twitched, but she stayed silent, tapping her spoon against her saucer. The conversation drifted, meandering through the usual pleasantries. The weather, the city council's recent ban on gas leaf blowers, the mayor's unexpected resignation. But every few minutes, Sam's gaze would snap back to the front door. Her thoughts weren't in the room. Ruth noticed. Clara noticed. Mark, predictably, did not. Eventually, Clara stood up and smoothed the front of her blouse. "I'll take my coffee outside," she said. "It's a little too warm in here." She stepped onto the porch with a graceful swiftness, and once the screen door swung shut behind her, a distinct snort of laughter followed, brief and stifled, but unmistakable. Ruth sipped her coffee, unbothered. "She finds a lot of things amusing lately," she said mildly. Sam said nothing. The silence that lingered after Clara stepped out stretched longer than polite conversation allowed. Ruth didn't bother filling it. She sat with her coffee balanced in one hand, her other resting casually on the tablecloth, her posture relaxed in a way that always made Sam a little uneasy. Across the table, Sam picked at the edge of her napkin, her fingers tense, restless. She glanced toward the door again, not subtly, and then back at Ruth. "So, what was it made from exactly?" she asked, voice light, measured, as if she were genuinely curious. Ruth tilted her head slightly, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's the silver you told me not to touch?" For a beat, nothing moved. Then Sam blinked. "Excuse me?" Ruth sipped her tea. "The good silver, the one I was apparently saving for a special occasion. You remember that message you sent?" Mark looked up from his phone, startled. "Wait, what do you mean? That silver?" "I mean exactly that silver," Ruth said calmly. "Every fork, every spoon, every petty restriction you tried to place around it. Melted, reformed, repurposed." Sam's mouth opened, then closed again. Her eyes flicked to Mark as if hoping he'd intervene. He did, poorly. "Mom," he said, setting his phone down, "you melted it?" Ruth's expression didn't waver. "I did. Into something useful, something that doesn't collect dust or wait for someone else's permission to exist." Sam leaned forward, voice rising. "That was family property." Clara's laugh floated in from the porch, sharp, amused, perfectly timed. She didn't even have to be in the room to land a punch. Ruth placed her cup gently on its saucer. "Number it was a gift, to Harold and me for our wedding. I have the original receipt, the provenance documentation, and a letter from Linda confirming sole ownership. It was never community property, never yours." Sam's face flushed. "You could have discussed it with us. That set meant something." "It did," Ruth interrupted. "To me, it meant history and use and memory, not control." Mark cleared his throat again, clearly out of his depth. "Okay, let's just maybe take a breath." Ruth turned to him. Her voice stayed steady, but the softness had gone. "I took a breath for 10 years, Mark, while she made decisions about my home, my things, and expected me to be grateful for it. You sat by and called it compromise." Mark had no response. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his silence finally starting to look like recognition. Sam stood abruptly. "So that's it? You just decided, no warning, no conversation." "Funny," Ruth said, lifting her cup again. "That's exactly how your text came across." Sam's hands curled into fists at her sides. "You knew we were planning to use it. For Thanksgiving. For show. Ruth cut in again. You wanted it on your table, in your dining room, to tell a story that had nothing to do with you. Clara appeared in the doorway just then, arms folded, leaning against the frame like she was watching the final scene of a play she'd seen coming from Act 1. Linda filed the documentation this morning, Ruth added, addressing neither of them specifically. It's official now. Every inch of that silver is legally mine, in any form I choose. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sam looked at Mark again, but he was no longer meeting her eyes. His shoulders had dropped, his mouth pressed into a thin, resigned line. Whatever argument he might have had didn't seem worth unwrapping. Clara stepped fully inside, plucked a lemon bar from the plate, and popped it into her mouth. Well, she said, chewing, I think we can call that settled. Ruth stood and walked to the door. She opened it with deliberate grace, her fingers resting on the silver handle, now gleaming in the midday light. If you're finished with your coffee, she said, I think it's time I got back to my day. The house was quiet again. Not the heavy, uncertain quiet of before. This was something lighter, something earned. Ruth sat at her roll-top desk with the afternoon light spilling across the polished surface. The framed photo of the silver handle stood like a sentry beside her laptop. She adjusted the angle slightly before clicking open her email. The subject line wrote itself. Subject: Ellis Silver. Ownership and transformation confirmation. She attached a PDF with scanned copies of the original receipt, wedding photo, and a notarized letter from Linda. Below that, she added high-resolution photos Clara had taken of the handle, detailed shots that showed every curve, every weld, and the engraved initials that had already outlasted a generation's entitlement. No explanation, no justifications, just the facts. She hovered over the recipient's field for a moment before typing them in mark.ellis@email.com, samantha.ellis@email.com. Then she hit send. Across the hall, Buddy the cat yawned from under the windowsill, stretched, and went back to sleep. Outside, the gardenia bush stirred in a soft breeze, its fragrance lifting through the air like punctuation. Ruth leaned back in her chair and waited, not nervously, not impatiently. She had planted the flag, let the silence do its work. It took less than an hour. Her phone buzzed. One new email from Mark Ellis. No greeting, no subject. Just, I guess it's fine, if it means that much to you. Ruth read it twice, then set the phone down without replying. The message wasn't approval, it was surrender wrapped in the language of reluctance, and it was more than enough. From Sam, there was nothing. No message, no call, no attempt to rebut. Ruth pictured her staring at the photos, jaw clenched, hands shaking, looking for an argument the law had already taken from her. That evening, Clara showed up without warning, as usual, holding a bottle of champagne and two mismatched flutes in one hand, a paper grocery bag in the other. You're not allowed to go full outlaw without some kind of toast, she said, stepping inside. I brought fancy cheese. The good kind, not that sad cube platter from the grocery store. Ruth smiled. The law isn't outlaw. Depends on the neighborhood, Clara said, popping the cork with the confidence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. They sat on the porch, feet up, the last rays of sunlight sliding golden across the banister. Clara poured them each a glass, handed one over, and raised hers. To making things useful again, she said, and to using the law like a letter opener. Ruth clinked her glass against hers. To not waiting for permission. They drank in silence for a while, the kind that needed no narration. Later, after Clara left, Ruth stayed outside. The porch light hadn't come on yet, and the silver handle caught what little dusk remained, glinting softly like it was holding on to something just a little longer than necessary. She rose and retrieved a soft polishing cloth from the drawer beside the entryway. With slow, careful strokes, she ran it along the handle. Not to clean it, not really. It was already spotless. But to feel it, to make contact. The silver warmed under her hand, solid, true. Inside the house, her phone buzzed again. Not an email this time, but a text from Linda. "It's done. The full paperwork's registered with the county. Her name's nowhere near it." Ruth typed back 2 words. "Thank you." She looked at the door once more, her fingers grazing the monogram at the base. The photographer arrived on a Wednesday morning, just after 9, dressed in linen and carrying a camera with a lens so large, Ruth felt it might belong to a wildlife crew rather than a neighborhood magazine. He was polite, efficient, and clearly charmed by the house before he'd even crossed the threshold. "It's the handle that caught our eye," he said as he framed his first shot. "One of our interns saw it on a local architect's Instagram, said it stopped her mid-scroll." Ruth stood just inside the doorway, coffee in hand, while the man crouched, shifted angles, adjusted the light. "It's just a door," she said mildly. "Not to us," he replied, smiling through the lens. "This kind of work, it speaks. There's history in the metal. You don't see that often anymore." The shoot took less than 20 minutes. He snapped wide shots of the entryway, close-ups of the etched initials, a few candids of Ruth herself, standing with the door cracked open, hand resting just so on the curve of the handle. When he was finished, he asked for her name, the artisan's name, and a short quote. "Why did you commission it?" Ruth considered that for a moment, then she said, "Because sometimes usefulness is the best form of remembrance." He scribbled it down, shook her hand, and left with a promise that the piece would run in the next issue of Low Country Living. By the following Tuesday, it was on stands across Charleston and delivered to half the mailboxes in Ruth's neighborhood. The title ran across the top in elegant serif font, "Silver lining, a Charleston woman turns history into art." The photos were beautiful. The article was brief but reverent. It mentioned the craftsmanship, the quiet elegance of the design, the personal touch of initials. There was no drama, no allusion to its origin story, just a graceful telling of transformation. Ruth clipped the article and laid it flat on the kitchen counter, smoothing the crease. That afternoon, neighbors began to appear. Margaret Phelps from 2 doors down came by with a loaf of cranberry bread and a warm, "You've always had an eye, Ruth." Mrs. Atwell, who barely spoke unless it was HOA related, stood at the end of Ruth's driveway and simply nodded toward the door. "It's beautiful," she said. "It feels permanent." Even the new couple who'd just moved in last month, the ones who drove the electric Volvo and wore wide-brimmed hats unironically, rang the bell just to ask for the metalworker's name. Ruth accepted each compliment with quiet gratitude and a cup of coffee if they stayed long enough. Clara arrived last, already waving the article in one hand. "I bought 3 copies," she announced, stepping into the foyer. "One for your scrapbook, one for my scrapbook, and one in case Samantha accidentally sets the others on fire." Ruth laughed, genuinely, for the first time in days. Clara held the magazine up and squinted at the photo. "You look unbothered in this shot. Dangerous." "I am," Ruth said, setting the kettle on. Later that evening, Ruth tried calling Sam. She didn't expect a real conversation, but civility still had its place. The call rang twice, then went to voicemail. She left no message. She tried again the next day. Same result. On the 3rd day, she sent a text. "Saw the article. Hope you and Mark are doing well." No reply. It didn't hurt. Not anymore. Not in the way it once would have. There was nothing to chase. She had said what she needed to say. In words, in metal, in silence. By Friday, Ruth sat on the porch with her feet propped up and the handle catching the evening light beside her like a companion. Buddy curled on the doormat. The breeze stirred the magazine pages that lay open on her lap. The attorney's office smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil, not clinical, but intentional, like someone wanted to make sure the room felt neither too warm nor too sterile. Just respectful. Linda Fraser looked up from behind a thick walnut desk, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She'd known why Ruth was coming before she even called. "You're ready," she said, more statement than question. "I am," Ruth replied, settling into the chair opposite her. "It's time." Linda folded her hands. "We can make it simple. Clean, ironclad." "Good," Ruth said. "I want it like the handle, permanent, unmistakable, and hard to argue with." Linda nodded once and turned her monitor toward herself, fingers already clicking into motion. The existing will names Mark and Samantha Ellis as beneficiaries of the estate, with a full transfer of assets, including the house, effective upon your passing. You'd like to amend that? Ruth met her eyes. Strike them both. Linda didn't blink. And in their place? The Charleston Metal Arts Endowment, Ruth said. I'd like the house sold and the proceeds transferred to their community grant program. They fund apprenticeships, women, veterans, people who still believe in making things that last. Linda made no comment. She simply typed. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the desk lamp and the subtle staccato of keystrokes. Ruth looked around the office as she waited. The walls were lined with framed prints of Charleston's historic homes, porches, gas lanterns, wrought iron balconies, structures with stories. When Linda turned the screen toward her again, the draft document was open. Her name, her address, her intent, all sharp and unambiguous. Read it over, Linda said. Take your time. Ruth did. Every line, every comma. When she reached the section that previously held Mark and Samantha's names and found it replaced with the endowments, her breath deepened. Not shaky, steady, anchored. I brought my witness, she said, and turned toward the doorway. Clara stepped in, dressed like she was heading to lunch at a country club she had no intention of joining. Her lipstick was coral, her heels louder than strictly necessary on the tile floor. She gave a short wave to Linda. Tell me where to sign, Clara said. I've been waiting for this moment since Ruth found the receipt. Linda slid the papers across the desk. Signatures were placed, witness lines filled. The final document was scanned and filed electronically by Linda's assistant within the hour. It's done, Linda said, clicking a final confirmation. Ruth sat for a moment longer, absorbing the quiet shift in her own gravity. Her legacy was no longer a polite assumption. It had shape, direction, purpose. Clara leaned over the desk and looked at the printed copy. That's a handle they'll never turn, she said with satisfaction. Ruth laughed, a sound that started low and rounded out fully by the time it reached the back of her throat. That's the idea. They walked out into the Charleston sun, where the sidewalk shimmered faintly with heat. Ruth wore sunglasses. Clara didn't. She claimed squinting was a free facelift. Lunch? Clara asked as they reached the car. I'd like that, Ruth said. They drove off, and for the first time in years, Ruth didn't glance back at the idea of her own absence. She didn't need to. What she'd leave behind had already begun to live. Back at the house, the door handle caught the afternoon light. It didn't sparkle. It held, like it understood what it was protecting. Inside, Buddy stirred from the windowsill, yawned, and blinked toward the porch. The voicemail had come in at 1:12 a.m. Ruth saw it the next morning as she stirred cream into her coffee. No name showed up on the screen, just the number. But she didn't need caller ID to recognize the cadence of desperation. She waited until Clara arrived before playing it. The message, preserved in Ruth's inbox for 12 hours and 46 minutes, was already souring. I want to hear it, Clara said, placing a brown paper bag of fresh scones on the counter. I need the theater. Ruth pressed play. Ruth, it's Samantha. I don't even know what to say anymore. You've made your point over and over again. You've taken more than I thought you would. Look, I know we've had differences, but this doesn't feel fair. Not to Mark, not to your granddaughter. You're erasing your family over one decision, one grudge. Just think about that. There was a brief silence, and then Sam's voice returned, thinner now. You won't even talk to me. That house was supposed to be part of our lives, of hers. What are we supposed to tell her? That we lost it to a handle? The message ended in a strained breath. Clara whistled low. Wow. Ruth deleted the voicemail with a single tap. No hesitation, no ceremony. She wants the story to sound like theft, Ruth said, sipping her coffee. But she doesn't get to narrate anymore. Clara unwrapped the scones. And that, my friend, is what we call a plot correction. 2 days later, Ruth received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside was a certified copy of the updated will, printed on official watermarked paper and sealed with a notary's stamp. Linda's letter was clipped neatly to the top. Ruth, per your request, enclosed is the certified copy for your records. Consider it settled. Linda. Ruth placed the letter on her office desk. Beside it, she laid the framed magazine article, the photo of the silver handle, and finally, the will itself, slid gently into a fresh brass frame she'd bought that morning at the hardware store. It wasn't ornate. It didn't need to be. The arrangement made her office feel complete for the first time in years, not in a decorative sense, in a legacy sense. Buddy purred softly from under the desk, curled into his usual crescent, paws twitching in dream. His tail flicked lazily as Ruth knelt to scratch behind his ears. "Still here," she murmured, "still watching." She stood and opened the window halfway. The afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees and spilled golden across the floorboards, illuminating the corner of the room and, just beyond the study door, the silver handle gleaming quietly in the foyer. The metal caught the light like a living thing, a keepsake not of tradition, but of choice. Ruth walked to it, pressed her fingers against its spine and let them rest there. It was cool, solid, reassuring. She didn't expect another sound that day, not beyond the hum of cicadas or Buddy's occasional snore. But the phone rang. She checked the screen. Jack Turner. She answered on the second ring. "Jack." "Hey, Ruth. Didn't mean to interrupt your afternoon. Got something you might want to know." "Go on." "Well," he said, his tone half amused, half inquisitive. "I was cleaning out my back supply bin and realized I still had some of your silver scraps. Cuttings, slivers, bits that didn't pour clean. Not enough for another handle, but not nothing either." Ruth didn't speak. She just listened. "I was going to recycle it," Jack continued, "but something told me to ask. Would you like me to hold on to it? Maybe see if we can make something else?" Ruth looked out the window again, past the oak branches, to where her granddaughter's tricycle still leaned against the garage, half forgotten, but not discarded. "Hold on to it," she said. "I may have one more use in mind." Ruth held the phone to her ear, the cord curled between her fingers like a ribbon of thought. "I want something small," she told Jack. "Not flashy, quiet." "Necklace?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "A pendant, just enough silver to wear without apology." Jack didn't hesitate. "I've got enough for that, barely, but it'll be personal, unique." "That's all I've ever wanted." When she hung up, the house was calm. Outside, a light rain softened the garden, droplets gliding off the hydrangeas like secrets. Buddy stirred under the reading chair, blinked twice, and went back to sleep. 3 days later, Jack rang the bell just after 10. Ruth opened the door, surprised to see him without his usual apron. He wore a dark chambray shirt and clean boots, a cardboard box under one arm. "No forge dust today?" she asked, amused. "I figured this deserved a cleaner delivery." She let him in. The box was small, the kind that might hold stationery or keepsakes. Jack placed it on the dining table with a gentle weight, as if whatever sat inside had already learned how to hold meaning. He peeled back the tissue. Inside, a pendant no bigger than a postage stamp, suspended from a fine silver chain. The design was simple, elegant. A spoon bowl, flattened and shaped into a soft oval, its surface engraved with a pattern of gentle ridges that mimicked the door handle's spine. Nestled at the base were the initials again, E.E., etched with almost imperceptible grace. Ruth inhaled. "You kept the language." Jack nodded. It felt wrong to leave it out. At that moment, Clara walked in from the porch, sunglasses perched atop her head, and a lemonade in hand. She took one look at the table and whistled. "Well, if that isn't the final stanza." Ruth lifted the chain delicately, let it dangle from her fingers like wind-held silk. "Will you help me?" "Of course." Clara set her drink down and stepped behind her. The clasp was tiny. Clara's fingers, practiced and sure, guided it into place. "There," she said, "like armor." Ruth turned to the mirror in the hallway. The pendant rested just above her collarbone. Not bold, not loud, but absolute. The next morning, Ruth wore it to the coffee house on the corner, the one with the chalkboard menus and the antique mismatched chairs, where half the neighborhood came to exchange gossip disguised as local news. Clara joined her 15 minutes later, her entrance as usual, breezy and without subtlety. "You wore it," she said, pleased. "I wanted to see if anyone noticed," Ruth replied, though she already knew the answer. Because they did. The first compliment came from Grace Atwell, who managed the local bookstore and always wore scarves that matched the seasons. "That necklace is stunning," she said, peering closer. "Where did you get it?" "Custom," Ruth answered simply. The second came from a young barista, a college student with blue eyeliner and chipped nails. "That's real silver, right? It looks like it tells a story." Ruth smiled. "It does." By the time Clara posted a photo, the two of them seated by the window, coffee mugs in hand, sunlight catching the pendant just right, the attention was sealed. The caption read, "Still sharp, still silver, still standing." That night, Ruth received a phone call. She didn't answer it. The next morning, she got a text. From Mark. "Sam saw the photo. She's upset again. Thinks you're trying to provoke her." Ruth didn't respond. Not immediately. She waited until the late afternoon, when the sun reached through the windows again and made the pendant flash like a second heartbeat. Then she replied with 3 words. It wasn't hers. She placed the phone face down and resumed polishing the frame on her desk, the one holding her will, beside the silver article, beside the handle photo. The museum of her becoming. Buddy jumped onto the desk without asking permission, curled beside the papers, and blinked at her. "Everyone wants a piece of the story," Ruth said softly, "until they realize they weren't the ones who wrote it." She touched the pendant again, then looked toward the door. Outside, the handle gleamed, unbothered. Inside, the silver pressed cool against her skin, and stayed. The sun rose without apology, bold and gold and wide across the Charleston sky, as if it had something to prove. Ruth stepped out onto the porch with a fresh cup of coffee in one hand and the quiet contentment of someone who no longer owed anyone an explanation. She wore linen, pale, comfortable, dignified, and her silver pendant rested against her chest like punctuation. The house behind her creaked faintly in the morning warmth, old bones stretching. Familiar, steady. Her hand reached instinctively for the front door. The silver handle was cool to the touch. Always was, even under sun. She ran her fingers along the length of it, not to test it, not to check its shine, but simply because she could, because she wanted to. The curves had softened over time, not dulled, but settled. The initials at the base still caught the light if you looked closely, still whispered a history that only she and Harold had lived fully. She stood there a moment longer, fingers still on the handle, letting her weight rest in the small gesture. Then she turned and took her seat on the porch. Clara arrived 5 minutes later, holding 2 muffins in a brown paper bag and muttering about the line at the bakery like it was a personal affront. "I told them," she said, dropping into her chair, "if they ever get rid of the blueberry streusel, I'll stage a coup." Ruth handed her the spare mug. "And how did they take that?" "Like people who underestimate short women in wedges." Clara sipped. "They'll learn." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, feet stretched toward the banister, the sun inching its way across the porch floor. A jogger passed on the sidewalk, young, sweaty, earbuds in. She slowed for half a step as she neared the porch, her eyes flicking toward the handle. Clara caught it. "That's the 3rd one this week." Ruth nodded. "It doesn't ask for attention. It earns it." A dog walker followed, then a couple out for a stroll. Each one glanced, not obviously, not for long, just enough to acknowledge that something was different, something beautiful, something built to last. "I used to hate this porch," Ruth said softly. "After Harold died, it felt like a stage, a place where people passed and expected you to wave, to smile, to carry on." "And now?" Clara asked. "Now it's mine." Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Ruth took another sip, the coffee just beginning to cool. A breeze lifted her hair and carried with it the faint scent of cut grass and gardenia. Her eyes wandered to the edge of the porch, to the spot where Harold used to stand when waiting for guests, or deliveries, or just for no reason at all. He'd lean on the railing with one hand and tap his ring against the wood with the other. Always the same rhythm. Always the same patience. "I think he'd like it," Ruth said, mostly to herself. "The handle?" "Number all of it." Clara reached over and gave her wrist a small squeeze. "He'd be in awe." "I think," Ruth said, smiling now, "he'd be relieved." They finished their coffee. The sun climbed higher. The muffins disappeared in stages. At some point, a breeze rattled the screen door slightly, but it didn't open. When it was time to go, Ruth stood and brushed the crumbs from her lap. Clara gathered the mugs. "I'll see you tomorrow?" Clara asked. "You always do," Ruth said, grinning. She turned to the door, and this time, as her hand met the handle, she didn't just hold it, she grasped it. Firm, present, like someone who knew the difference between inheritance and intention. The door opened easily. The house welcomed her in, not as caretaker, but as owner. And before she stepped inside, she turned back once more, letting the light catch the metal just so. "Some things," Ruth said aloud, "aren't meant to be polished and stored. They're meant to be held." Then she closed the door behind her, and it clicked with certainty.